Hey everybody, welcome to Thursday's edition of Where All the Ladies At. I'm so excited I love history, you know me, I'm a nerd. So maybe you don't know me. If you don't know me, my name is Kim, I'm a history nerd, I am a writer, I am a life coach, I have all kinds of cool stuff. But most of all, I am the host for this podcast and I am the brains behind it because I thought, hey, there doesn't seem to be a lot of women in history. This is how it started. And I'm sure we did things in the past. I'm sure women did a lot of things, but there's like a handful of people that we know about, and everybody else is kind of like, ooh. So I started thinking about it that way, and I really dove into it. And then I was like, you know what? Let's talk about myth and legend too. So if you are into myth and legend, make sure you go back to Monday's edition. This month we're covering Illyrian goddesses, and it's pretty cool. And on Thursday's edition this month, we are covering women warriors, or just basically women, warrior queens, badass women, and there is some pretty cool ones. Yes, so last week we covered Tomarus, who's absolutely cool. This week we are staying in Illyria, and we're going to talk about Teuta, the pirate queen. And next week we talk about King Tamar, so a queen that became a king. And then the following week we talk about Kubaba, who is a queen that became a goddess. Who knew you could climb that high on the ladder? It's pretty cool. So yeah, and that's kind of what I'm doing this month. And if that sounds cool to you, then hey, like, follow, share, comment, share, do all the follow, subscribe, do all those fun things. Yeah. That would be amazing, and you'll get more. And if you're interested in this stuff and this is your first time seeing me or hearing me, make sure you go back. I have a pretty decent sized catalog of podcasts about a whole plethora of different people. So as I said, this week's episode is going to be on Teuta, the pirate queen of Illyria. So we'll get into her in a second. Before we do, let's do some housekeeping and some shameless plugging. If you want to reach out to me, you can most definitely do that. I have social media. There's also an email. And you can also, if you're watching this on YouTube, just comment and I always respond. If you are wanting to support the podcast, like I said, like, comment, share, follow, subscribe, all that kind of good stuff. Any interaction with this podcast tells the algorithm that you like what you're seeing and maybe it would be interesting for other people, and then more people will see me and we can build a bigger community, because I would really like to see this community grow and maybe do some more fun stuff. Like, I have some like wild ideas in my head if I get a large enough crowd, and one of those ideas might have to do with travel. So I'm just saying, just putting it out there. The more people that follow me, the more people that subscribe, the more people that interact and that kind of stuff, the more I think that we can grow this into something bigger. If you want more information on this and so much more, make sure you check out my Medium publication. It hasn't been real consistent, but it's going to start being better. Knock on wood. And also, if you would like to, if you like magical, spiritual, holistic stuff, you can definitely check out my other podcast. I have another one called Our Mystic Road Trip, where I talk about that kind of stuff: tarot, ley lines, crystals, herbs, shadow work, holistic diet, all that kind of stuff. Anything like that is my other passion in life. Yeah, I think that's it for the shameless plugging and the housekeeping. So let's get into this amazing woman, Teuta, the pirate queen of Illyria. All right, so let's talk about Teuta, right? So she was basically in the middle of the 3rd century BCE, right? And she was a big deal, but why? We'll talk about that in a minute. So first, let's talk about what was going on. So I want to give a real good look at what was going on in Illyria at the time, and also what was like for women. Okay, so let's dive into Illyria in 3rd century BCE, right? So this is the region as a giant, it's pretty much giant untamed landscape, right? And it's really along the western edge of the Balkans. So if you've listened to my other podcasts, on the Illyrian goddesses, you're going to hear some of the same stuff. So this would be areas like Albania, parts of Croatia, Montenegro, parts of Bosnia, Herzegovina, right? But back then, it wasn't these weren't unified countries, right? It was like different tribes that were constantly kind of battling with themselves for dominance, right? And each tribe had its own ambition, right? Different rulers, different alliances, different rivalries, all this like had this constant changing power structure, right? It was sort of like the Wild West, right? Among those tribes was, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Ardiaei. I think that's how you pronounce it. And they stood out as one of the most influential and most powerful of the tribes, right? This was the tribe that Teuta belonged to. And it wasn't just really about muscle for them. They controlled the Adriatic Sea, right? The sea wasn't just a pretty view, it was the key to trading, right? So whoever controlled access to it and had the military power of it, were pretty powerful, right? So the RDAE, I'm going to say, were very smart about using that to their advantage, right? But here's where it comes in, right? Illyria was kind of famous for its piracy. You know, it had some pirates, and not like the fun swashbuckling, like woo 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 with parrots. No, these pirates were marauders, right? They disrupted trade routes, they hijacked ships, they caused mayhem all over the Mediterranean, and not on a small scale. The Illyrian pirates were a very serious nuisance to the rest of the ancient world. They knew how to sail, they knew how to strike fast, they knew how to stay one step ahead of their enemies. So this didn't really sit too well with the Romans of the time, right? The Romans were on the rise. They were starting to build their empire, right? They were pushing further and further into the Mediterranean. But they weren't about to and they didn't really want to let a bunch of freaking pirates mess with their plans. So by the 3rd century BCE, the Romans were really hungry for control of the Mediterranean and the Adriatic, right? They weren't going to allow this independent power anymore. So Illyria's piracy really posed a direct threat to the Roman interest, which meant it was only a matter of time before they would come knocking on Teuta's tribe's door, right? And so it was kind of a very hectic time period. Also, I want to make a note. I know some people may not understand when I say BC, and I honestly, I know some people do and some people don't, but I know there's places in the world where they still use BC. BCE means before Common Era. It's basically translation of what BC used to be, which was before Christ. So they just changed it to before Common Era, if that makes sense, hopefully. All right. So let's talk about women, right? Because we're talking about Teuta. She was a pirate queen. We need to talk about what their role was, right? The women in Illyria during this very chaotic time, you know, didn't have it easy. It wasn't a walk in the park, right? They were expected to stay home, raise children, and do that stuff, but there was also this like warrior spirit in them, right? So we talked a little bit about some of the other tribes. Very much the women were just as much warriors as them. In this tribe, it was maybe a little bit different. I don't know, but they're still, even though they were warriors, they were still looked at to have these things, right? Women in those cases, especially if they were upper class and the royal, could have very significant power and influence, right? It may not have been like the power that we think of today, you know, but women in Illyria were still, like I said, they were still on the battlefield with men. They did all these things. They also had a say in the way their family and tribe ran, right? So there was a lot of women that did become very political and militarily involved in the decision-making process, right? Especially if their male husbands or whatever were incapacitated. So It was a patriarchal society in a lot of ways. And I'm not going back on anything I said before, but the women had different roles. And it was a place where women could very well fight for their tribes, fight for their land, fight for everything. Granted, they still had to, do the stuff that they were deemed to do, but they were stronger and had a lot more sway when it came to those things. So now we have a little idea what it was like. So let's talk about Queen Teuta. All right. So Queen Teuta wasn't just a normal queen, right? She was very powerful. She was very fearless, and she was there to make sure her tribe held on to its power in the Adriatic. And this all started from an early life, right? Obviously there's not a lot written, so a lot of her early life is going to be kind of mysterious. We don't have really many detailed records, right? What we do know is that she was part of the Adriatic tribe, and that was one, as I said, one of the most strongest and treasured tribes in Western Balkans. And so this area, because it did have so many competing tribes and everybody was vying for controls, the one that held the trade routes, as I said, was good. So the Adriatic, under King Agron, and that was Teuta's husband, had kind of risen to prominence, right? Through whether it was a combination of military power and strategic alliances. They were very smart. Agron's reign was pretty much marked by pretty aggressive expansion, and there's many that feel that Teuta probably played a really big role in supporting this, even before she became the queen, right? So Agron passed away in 231 BCE, pretty unexpectedly. And by the way, I'm not saying anything, but sometimes when they unexpectedly die, there was somebody helping them, right? There's no evidence that happens, just kind of from reading all the things and studying history. It's just something that kind of sparked my thoughts, right? So Teuta had been his wife, and now she found herself in a position of power. She became regent, which often happens with queens, for her stepson Pinnes, who was really too young to rule on his own, right? But Teuta didn't really take a back seat. She gradually stepped into the role of leadership, and she pretty effectively took control of the kingdom. And that was not an easy feat, and she had to really show her dominance, especially since the rest of the tribal leaders were men. So she had to really navigate this world that was kind of, not really well known for really liking ladies there. That didn't stop her though. So Teuta used her position to maintain the kingdom, and she extended it, right? Teuta's reign was kind of marked by just a continuation of what her husband had been on, right? Very aggressive, very expansionist policies. Agron had built kind of this reputation of waging pirate raids against Greek and Roman merchant ships. And Teuta said, hey, let's just keep that going. It's been working for us. I think it's a good idea. So the pirates of Illyria were kind of really notorious for, in the Mediterranean, right? Sorry, I stumbled. They disrupted trade routes, as I said, seized ships, and they just basically created chaos everywhere, right? For our Adriatic tribe, piracy was kind of a means of securing wealth and power. And for the Romans, as I said earlier, who were trying to expand their own empire, it was like a pain in the butt, right? So Teuta was pretty keen on maintaining this power, and she really wasn't afraid to confront the Roman Empire, and she used her forces to kind of challenge their growing influence in the Mediterranean, right? She pushed back against their control of the sea routes and really took a lot of bold actions to solidify her tribe's position. And she really, while she did that, she still began to just aggression everywhere. And she just pretty much continued what her husband had been doing. So in this sense, she was the queen who wasn't afraid to live on the edge, right? She challenged the might of Rome, and even when it meant, and even when that meant, making powerful enemies. So By 229 BCE, the Romans had grown pretty tired of these disruptions caused by the Illyrian pirates, and they were beginning to focus more on expanding the influence through the Mediterranean as well. And Illyria was in the way, so they decided to act, right? The Romans sent ambassadors to Teuta, demanding that she said, hey, you've got to stop this piracy thing. But Teuta she's like, no, I don't want to. She stood firm kind of in her authority. She didn't want to back down. So to the Romans, this was an act of defiance, right? I think to anybody, right? And they were like, no, we can't have this. We're trying to expand. Everybody else needs to see that we are the badasses, right? So basically kind of what followed was the First Illyrian War. The Romans launched this military campaign against Teuta's forces, and they wanted to end piracy once and for all. The war didn't really go well for Teuta, despite the fact she was so bold and she had great leadership. The Romans were too powerful, right? So Teuta was forced to surrender a pretty large portion of her territory and agree to pay tribute to Rome. And the defeat was pretty significant, and it kind of marked a huge turning point for Illyria. But Teuta wasn't completely crushed, of course. She lost ground, and she managed to hold on to the northern territories of her kingdom, though. Her reign may have ended in defeat, I think is the thing, but her legacy as a fierce leader and a resilient queen kind of endured. In fact, in Albania today, her name is still celebrated. It's used for sports clubs and towns, and even like cultural references. Even though she lost to Rome, her story was a story of resistance, right? Especially for women and leadership and positions. She showed that, it doesn't matter if you're in a male-dominated world. Like, if you have strength and determination, you can be just as powerful, Her reign marked that really big moment in Illyrian history. And, she didn't win the war, like I said, but she just wasn't forgotten, and that's kind of cool, right? So let's talk about the historical and archaeological evidence. So there's a little bit. Let's see. I'm getting my notes out, guys. All right, so here's the thing. The historical archaeological evidence is a bit of a mixed bag here, right? Because there's no doubt she was a real figure. And she definitely made her mark in Illyrian history. But much of what we know about her comes from external sources, so Roman accounts, right? And this is where things can get a little bit tricky because, as you imagine, the Romans weren't big fans of Teuta, right? So most of the details we have about her reign come from like ancient historians like Polybius or Appian, and they were writing about the First Illyrian War and Rome's conflict with the Illyrians. So the accounts naturally paint Teuta in a certain light, right? Polybius, for example, he says, describes her as a young and ambitious queen who continued her husband's aggressive expansionist policies, including piracy. So these writers basically tell us that Teuta ruled as a regent for her stepson after her husband's death, and she didn't hesitate to challenge Rome when they demanded she stop the piracy. The conflict then led to, as I said, the First Illyrian War. However, we have to remember that these Romans were recording the events from their perspective, often with a bias toward Rome's superiority and interest. So Teuta's role as a fierce pirate queen might have been exaggerated or villainized in a lot of accounts. On the archaeological side of things, the evidence is a bit more elusive, right? There are no direct inscriptions or monuments from Teuta herself, which kind of makes it hard to pin down specifics about her reign. There have been various findings in the Illyrian region that provide some, they show some context to the time which she ruled. For example, the ruins of ancient Illyrian fortresses, like those in modern-day Albania, often insight into the military culture of the time, right? They offer that insight. These strongholds would have been critical for protecting against external threats, right? Like Rome. So the artifacts found at these sites, like weapons and pottery and all this normal stuff, help archaeologists and historians kind of piece together the everyday life of Illyrians, though they don't directly link to Teuta. Archaeological excavations in places like the ancient city of Rizan, which is modern-day Rizan in Montenegro, have kind of unearthed evidence of a thriving Illyrian civilization with connections to Greek and Roman cultures. And this would suggest that Teuta's people were well integrated into the broader Mediterranean world, maybe participating in trade, diplomacy, and, as we said, piracy. But there's no definitive proof that ties us directly to Teuta. Despite this, Teuta's name and legacy really endure in a lot of local traditions and historical records, and we may not have that treasure chest of evidence. The accounts from the Roman writers and the broad archaeological context can be put together to tell us a little bit about the turbulent times she lived through. And that's pretty impressive. So let me get my notes taken down. So what did Teuta leave behind? As I said, not much. One thing is the stories, right? They kind of rolled down through time, and like I said, her legacy lives on in modern day Albania, and that's pretty impressive, Teuta's story is one of defiance and strength and perseverance, and even though the history books might focus on her loss, the real victory is how she held on to her people and her legacy, right? Something that can't be taken. Here's just a little fun fact. This is how her name still resonates, right? So Teuta, like I said, they use her name in modern day Albania, and there's actually this popular sports club called Teuta Doris, and that's named after her. So you can see, like, there's still this like respect, this pride in her and how she stood up to Rome. And that's it, guys. That is Teuta, the pirate queen who really fought for her people and really pissed off some Romans for a long time, She basically should be remembered. There's a lot of cool things about her, and though we don't have any written records, there's definitely something to be said about giving her story a little bit of light. And that's it, guys. That's it. As always, if you want to reach out to me, there's ways to do that. You want to support the podcast, there's ways to do that. At the very least, I would appreciate a like, follow, share, subscribe, all that kind of good stuff. If you want more, you can check out the Medium publication. And if you are into magical, mystical, spiritual, wellness, holistic, woo-woo kind of stuff, check out my other podcast called Our Mystic Road Trip. And as always, guys, I hope that the story of Teuta inspires you to go check out some more information, learn more about her and the region that she lived in. And as always, guys, stay curious, stay blessed, stay safe.